You are exhausted right now, not because you worked physically all day, but because at this exact moment, there is a furious debate happening inside your head. And the worst part, you are losing that argument to yourself. But what if the real reason your mind refuses to shut down is precisely your desperate attempt to force it into silence? Most people spend years trapped in invisible battles with their own thoughts without ever realizing it. One part of the mind creates fear, doubt, anxiety, and endless scenarios. Another part tries to control the chaos, force positivity, or mentally outrun the noise. And somewhere in the middle, your energy slowly disappears. The frightening thing is that this conflict becomes so normal that people start believing exhaustion is just part of life. They no longer remember what mental rest feels like. Even moments of silence become uncomfortable because the mind immediately fills the space with more internal noise. But there is something deeply liberating you are about to understand. Your peace does not come from defeating every thought inside your head. It comes from realizing you were never supposed to fight your own mind in the first place. You know that horrible feeling of laying your head on the pillow and out of nowhere your brain deciding to replay every chaotic scenario and every mistake from the past. We have been conditioned to believe this is a spiritual blockage or some kind of defect. But the surprising truth is that constant mental agitation is simply the brain operating in its most basic biological function of trying to solve problems and map out threats. Your mind was not designed to stay silent all the time. It was designed to keep you alive. Long before modern life existed, the human brain survived by constantly scanning for danger, predicting outcomes, remembering painful experiences, and preparing for what could go wrong next. That mechanism never disappeared. It simply adapted to a new environment. The problem is that your brain cannot always tell the difference between a real physical threat and an emotional possibility created by thoughts. To the nervous system, an unpaid bill, an awkward conversation from 3 years ago, or the fear of disappointing someone can trigger the same internal alarm that once helped human beings survive in dangerous environments. So when your thoughts start racing at night, it is not because your mind is broken. It is because your mental machine believes it is doing its job. And this changes everything, because the moment you stop treating your thoughts like enemies, you begin to see them differently. Most people create even more suffering by becoming terrified of their own mental activity. They hear anxious thoughts and immediately assume something is wrong with them. They start asking themselves dangerous questions in silence. Why can't I stop thinking? Why is my mind like this? Why can't I just relax like everyone else? But the irony is that this fear becomes fuel. Imagine a smoke detector that becomes more sensitive every time you panic about the sound it makes. That is exactly what happens inside your mind. The more emotional resistance you create towards certain thoughts, the more important your brain believes those thoughts must be. And because the brain is obsessed with protecting you, it keeps bringing them back to your attention again and again. Not because it hates you, because it thinks it is helping you survive. This is why trying to force the mind into silence often creates the opposite effect. Have you ever noticed how the moment you desperately try not to think about something, it suddenly becomes impossible to ignore? Someone tells you not to think about a red door, and instantly the image appears in your mind with even more intensity. The brain locks onto what carries emotional charge. Attention becomes instruction. And most people spend years accidentally instructing their minds to stay trapped in loops of tension. There is also something deeply exhausting about modern life that amplifies this internal noise. Your brain was never meant to process endless streams of information every hour of the day. Notifications, bad news, social pressure, constant comparison, unfinished tasks, hidden fears about the future. All of this creates mental overload. Your thoughts begin stacking on top of one another like papers covering a crowded desk. Eventually, the system starts overheating, not because you are weak, but because the machine is running non-stop without recovery. Sometimes you are not emotionally broken, you are mentally overstimulated. And yet, instead of understanding this natural process, many people turn the situation into a personal war. They judge themselves for having thoughts they never consciously chose in the first place. They believe spiritual growth means never feeling fear, never overthinking, never doubting, never experiencing mental noise. But that expectation alone creates another layer of suffering. A healthy mind produces thoughts continuously, just like the heart continuously produces beats. Some thoughts are useful, some are irrational, some are unfinished emotional echoes from old experiences, some are random static generated by stress and fatigue. Not every thought deserves interpretation, not every mental image carries meaning, and not every internal sentence reflects who you truly are. This is one of the most liberating realizations a person can have, because once you understand the natural function of the mental machine, you stop reacting to every thought as if it were an emergency. You begin to notice that the real exhaustion often does not come from the thoughts themselves, but from the endless struggle against them. And this is where an invisible mistake quietly begins to take control of people's lives, without them noticing. The moment the mind produces discomfort, most people instinctively move into combat mode. They try to eliminate, suppress, argue, replace or control every unwanted thought that appears. What feels like an attempt to create peace slowly becomes the exact mechanism feeding the chaos even more. The real problem begins when we try to fix what is not actually broken. There is a mistake almost all of us make while searching for peace, and it ends up throwing us directly into an abyss of mental exhaustion. I am going to reveal how to disarm this in moments. But first you need to understand the hidden mechanism behind this dangerous trap that steals your focus without you even noticing. Most people believe the goal is to eliminate uncomfortable thoughts as quickly as possible. The moment anxiety appears, they rush to fight it. The moment fear enters the mind, they try to replace it with something positive. The moment doubt shows up, they begin arguing internally, trying to prove to themselves that everything is fine. But what feels like self-protection slowly becomes a cycle of invisible self-conflict, because the mind interprets attention as importance. This is the silent mistake that fuels chaos inside so many people. Every time you stop your day to wrestle with a thought, your brain receives a message. This matters. Keep watching this. Even if the thought is irrational, even if it is exaggerated, even if it has no real connection to reality. The emotional reaction itself becomes proof to the nervous system that the thought deserves priority. And suddenly, one small mental spark becomes an internal wildfire. You can see this happen in ordinary moments of life. Someone sends a short text message that feels colder than usual. Instantly, the mind begins creating stories. Did I do something wrong? Are they upset with me? What if this changes everything? A simple moment becomes hours of mental noise, not because the original situation was dangerous, but because the mind entered a loop of trying to solve uncertainty through overanalysis. The brain hates unfinished emotional situations. It wants closure. It wants certainty. It wants control. So it keeps generating more thoughts in an attempt to finally reach safety. But here is the trap nobody talks about. Some mental loops cannot be solved through more thinking. In fact, more thinking often deepens the confusion. It is like trying to smooth water with your hands. The harder you try, the more disturbance you create. And this becomes incredibly draining, because most people are fighting battles inside themselves all day long without realizing it. Outwardly, they look calm, they go to work, they answer messages, they smile during conversations. But internally, there is constant tension, a non-stop debate. One side of the mind creates fearful thoughts, while another side desperately tries to silence them. The body remains trapped between those two forces, carrying stress hour after hour. That is why mental exhaustion can feel heavier than physical exhaustion. You are not only experiencing thoughts, you are resisting them, judging them, correcting them, fearing them, and monitoring them at the same time. The nervous system never fully relaxes because it believes danger is still active. And over time, this state of internal resistance starts affecting everything. Sleep becomes shallow. Concentration weakens. Small problems feel overwhelming. Even moments of peace begin to feel suspicious, because the brain has become addicted to scanning for the next problem. Many people unknowingly train themselves to live in a permanent state of psychological defense. What makes this even more painful is that society often rewards this behavior. Constant worrying is mistaken for responsibility. Overthinking is mistaken for intelligence. Emotional hypervigilance is mistaken for preparation. People convince themselves that if they keep analyzing every possible outcome, they can somehow prevent pain from happening. But life does not work that way. Some thoughts are not warnings, they are echoes, old emotional patterns repeating automatically because the brain learned them through stress, fear, or repetition. And when you treat every intrusive thought like an urgent message, you unknowingly give those patterns authority over your emotional state. This is why forcing positivity rarely works for long. You can repeat calming phrases all day, but if underneath that effort there is fear and resistance, the conflict remains active. The mind senses the struggle immediately. It knows you are still trying to escape something, and the more desperately you try to escape certain thoughts, the more energy they seem to gain. There is a hidden law operating beneath all of this that most people never notice. Whatever you continuously resist internally begins attaching itself to your attention more strongly, not because the thought is powerful by itself, but because your reaction keeps feeding it emotional energy. That is why some people spend years trying to defeat the same mental patterns and end up more exhausted than when they started. They are unknowingly strengthening the very thing they are trying to remove. And once you begin to understand how attention, resistance, and mental energy interact with each other, you start seeing why arguing with your own mind almost never creates peace. In fundamental physics, we know that every applied force generates opposing resistance and friction. Every time you argue with an intrusive thought, trying to prove to yourself that it is wrong in order to push it away, you inject your attention, which is pure vital energy, directly into it. You think you are destroying the mental monster, but in reality, you are feeding it a banquet so it can grow. This is the part most people never realize. Thoughts do not survive because they are always true or important. Many of them survive because they receive continuous emotional energy. Your focus becomes fuel, your resistance becomes reinforcement, and the more emotionally charged your reaction is, the more the mind marks that thought as something urgent that must be revisited. The brain is constantly learning from your behavior. If every time a fearful thought appears you stop everything to analyze it, defend yourself against it, or search for certainty, the brain interprets that reaction as evidence of danger. It does not say, "This person is trying to calm down." It says, "This thought triggered a major response. Keep monitoring this situation." And so the cycle continues. This is why some thoughts become mentally sticky. Not because they carry magical power, but because emotional friction keeps them alive inside your nervous system. Imagine rubbing your hands together continuously. The friction creates heat. Now imagine doing that mentally for hours every day. Every argument with yourself creates internal tension. Every attempt to mentally force peace creates more pressure. At some point, the body begins carrying the consequences of that invisible struggle. Tight shoulders, shallow breathing, constant fatigue, a nervous system that never fully powers down. And what makes this exhausting is how automatic it becomes. Most people do not even notice when the inner argument starts. A thought appears, and within seconds they are already trapped inside a courtroom inside their own head. One side attacks, the other side defends. One side predicts disaster, the other side tries to control the outcome. The entire system becomes consumed by mental noise. You can feel this clearly during moments of uncertainty. A person waiting for medical results, someone wondering if their relationship is falling apart, someone afraid of failure before making a major decision. The mind starts producing endless scenarios, and each scenario creates emotional reactions in the body, as if the event were already happening. Heart racing, muscles tightening, sleep disappearing. The body does not always react to reality itself. It reacts to the experience created by thoughts, and this is where energetic friction begins draining life force from people without them understanding why they feel so tired all the time. They believe exhaustion only comes from physical effort, but internal resistance consumes enormous amounts of energy. Constantly fighting your own mind is like driving a car with one foot on the accelerator and the other pressing the brake at the same time. The system overheats. What is even more dangerous is that resistance often disguises itself as control. People think, if I can just solve this thought, then I will finally feel peace. But peace does not come from winning arguments against every fearful possibility the mind invents, because the mind can always generate another scenario, another doubt, another what if. That machine never runs out of material. And this is why trying to dominate the mind through force becomes a losing battle. Force creates counterforce. Pressure creates resistance. The more aggressively you try to suppress certain thoughts, the more violently they tend to rebound into awareness later. You can see this in everyday life. The harder someone tries not to feel anxious before sleeping, the more awake they become. The harder they try not to think about failure, the more obsessed they become with outcomes. The harder they try to eliminate uncertainty, the more fragile their emotional state becomes, because internally they are creating friction against their own experience. And friction always consumes energy. There is also something important happening beneath the surface of all this. Thoughts themselves are often temporary. Many would naturally pass within seconds if they were not interrupted by resistance. But when you emotionally grab a thought and begin wrestling with it, you stop its natural movement. You hold it in place through attention. It is almost like trying to hold a wave still in the ocean. The wave keeps crashing against you because you refuse to let it move through naturally. And over time, this internal struggle becomes so normalized that people forget what mental stillness even feels like. They start identifying themselves with the noise. They believe the chaos inside them is their personality. But something deeper is happening underneath this entire process. There is a hidden separation between the mechanical production of thoughts and the awareness that notices them. And once a person begins discovering that difference for the first time, the entire structure of this inner conflict starts changing completely. If you keep accepting the invitation to every argument your mind proposes, this exhaustion stops being just one bad night of sleep. The situation advances into a critical state where your physical reality simply freezes, and your vital force, which should be focused on creating your future, becomes entirely drained fighting ghosts, generating a collapse of stress inside your body. At first, the damage seems small. You lose a little sleep. Your focus becomes weaker. You feel emotionally heavier than usual. But over time, something deeper begins happening. The constant conflict with your own thoughts slowly consumes the energy that should be supporting your daily life. Decisions become harder. Motivation fades. Even simple tasks start feeling strangely overwhelming. It is not because you are lazy or incapable. Your internal system is overloaded. The human mind and body are deeply connected, and the body keeps score of every unresolved inner battle. When the nervous system spends too much time trapped in mental defense mode, it stops prioritizing growth, creativity, clarity, and recovery. Survival becomes the main objective, and survival mode changes the way a person experiences reality. You begin reacting instead of living. This is why people caught in chronic mental conflict often describe feeling disconnected from themselves. They wake up tired even after sleeping. Conversations feel harder to follow. Joy becomes muted. Their attention stays trapped inside the same repetitive thoughts, while life continues moving around them. Days pass, but internally nothing feels alive. The frightening part is how gradually this collapse happens. Most people do not notice the moment their mental exhaustion starts shaping their physical reality. They only notice the symptoms later. Procrastination increases because the mind already feels overloaded before the day even begins. Relationships weaken because emotional presence disappears. Creativity dries up because all available energy is being spent managing internal noise. The person starts surviving their own mind instead of participating in life. And what makes this state so painful is that it creates a loop. The more exhausted you become, the harder it is to emotionally regulate your thoughts. And the harder it becomes to regulate your thoughts, the more exhausted you feel. Stress chemicals remain active inside the body for too long. Rest no longer feels restorative. The nervous system begins expecting tension even during peaceful moments. Eventually, calm itself can start feeling unfamiliar. This is why some people feel uncomfortable in silence. The moment external distractions disappear, all the suppressed mental activity rises to the surface. Thoughts that were hidden beneath work, entertainment, noise, and responsibilities suddenly become louder. And because the person has spent years fighting those thoughts instead of understanding them, the mind immediately enters defense mode again. The body follows that command instantly. Breathing shortens, muscles tighten, attention narrows. It becomes difficult to think clearly because the system believes danger is near, even when nothing threatening is actually happening in the present moment. This internal collapse also affects a person's ability to trust life itself. When the mind is constantly generating catastrophic scenarios, the future begins feeling emotionally unsafe. People stop taking healthy risks. They delay important decisions. They avoid opportunities, not because reality is collapsing around them, but because the inner field where perception is formed has become saturated with tension. And eventually, a person can become so identified with this mental struggle that they forget there was ever another way to exist. They start believing the exhaustion is their personality, but it is not. It is the consequence of carrying too much internal resistance for too long. Think about how much energy it takes to mentally rehearse conversations that have not happened yet, to replay mistakes from years ago, to constantly scan for hidden problems, to monitor every emotional sensation for signs that something is wrong. This endless state of hypervigilance drains life force quietly day after day. The tragedy is that many people believe this suffering means they are being responsible or spiritually aware. In reality, they are often trapped in an unconscious habit of psychological self-defense, and this habit spreads into every area of life. Even moments meant for rest become contaminated by mental tension. A vacation turns into worrying about returning home. Time with loved ones becomes interrupted by intrusive thoughts. Achievements lose their emotional impact because the mind immediately jumps toward the next problem to solve. Nothing ever feels complete. That is what happens when the internal field collapses under constant friction. Life itself begins feeling distant, almost unreachable, because your energy is no longer flowing toward creation, connection, or presence. It is being consumed by invisible resistance. And in the middle of this exhaustion, many people are given advice that sounds helpful on the surface, but quietly pushes them even deeper into conflict. They are told the solution is simply to stay positive, to force better thoughts into place, and to mentally reject anything negative the moment it appears. But this approach often creates an even more exhausting war inside the mind. This is where the vast majority of conventional spiritual advice fails you. They say the solution is to think positively and block negativity at all costs. But trying to forcibly replace a bad thought with a good one is voluntarily stepping into the ring to fight. And as long as you keep fighting your own reflection, the war will never end. The real way out of this is completely counterintuitive. At first, forced positivity sounds comforting. It gives the impression that you can control your emotional world simply by choosing better thoughts. People repeat affirmations they do not believe, smile while internally collapsing, and try to cover fear with artificial optimism. But underneath all of it, the tension remains alive, because the mind always detects resistance. You can say everything is fine 100 times, but if your nervous system still feels threatened, the body will continue reacting as if danger is present. This is why so many people feel exhausted even while trying to stay positive all day long. They are not finding peace, they are managing internal suppression, and suppression consumes enormous energy. Imagine trying to hold a beach ball underwater. For a few seconds you can force it down, but the pressure builds continuously beneath the surface. The moment your grip weakens, the ball explodes back upward with even more force. This is exactly what happens with unwanted thoughts. The harder you try to bury them under positive language, the more pressure builds internally. Eventually, the mind rebounds. That is why many people experience sudden emotional crashes after periods of forced positivity. They spend weeks trying to stay high vibration, trying to reject every negative feeling, trying to spiritually outperform their own humanity. Then, one difficult moment arrives, and the entire emotional structure collapses at once. Not because they failed, because emotional denial was never stability to begin with. There is also a subtle form of self-rejection, hidden inside forced positivity. When a person treats certain thoughts as unacceptable, they unconsciously divide themselves into two parts. One part becomes the good self that must remain calm, spiritual, and positive. The other part becomes the bad self filled with fear, anger, sadness, uncertainty, or doubt. And then the internal war deepens, because now every uncomfortable thought feels like evidence that something is wrong with who they are. Instead of simply observing a passing mental event, they personalize it. They attach identity to it. They believe the appearance of difficult thoughts means they are failing emotionally or spiritually. But being human means having mental movement. No healthy mind produces only calm and pleasant thoughts all the time. The brain generates fear sometimes. It imagines worst-case scenarios. It replays memories. It questions decisions. That activity alone is not the problem. The suffering begins when every uncomfortable thought is treated like an enemy invasion that must be defeated immediately. And modern culture quietly reinforces this misunderstanding. People are taught to optimize every emotion, control every feeling, and eliminate all discomfort as quickly as possible. But life does not become peaceful through emotional perfection. In fact, the obsession with constant positivity often creates fragile people who become terrified of their own inner world, because they never learned how to sit with uncertainty without fighting it. There is a major difference between genuine peace and emotional control. Genuine peace does not require constant management. It does not panic when difficult thoughts appear. It does not collapse when anxiety enters the room. Peace comes from no longer being at war with the natural movement of the mind. And this is why forcing positive thinking can become spiritually exhausting. The person spends all day monitoring their internal state, trying to maintain mental purity, trying to reject anything dark or uncomfortable before it grows. But the constant monitoring itself creates tension. They become hyper-aware of every passing thought, constantly asking themselves, "Am I thinking correctly? Am I attracting something bad? Am I ruining my energy?" That fear quietly strengthens the very thoughts they are trying to escape, because once again attention becomes fuel. The mind starts revolving around avoidance instead of presence. Instead of living life directly, the person becomes trapped in endless self-correction. They stop trusting their own emotional experience. Every negative sensation becomes a threat. Every difficult thought becomes an emergency. And over time, this creates profound emotional fatigue. The truly transformative shift happens when a person realizes they do not need to replace every negative thought with a positive one. They do not need to wrestle the mind into submission. They do not need to force silence or manufacture emotional perfection. Something much more powerful becomes possible when you stop trying to control every thought and begin discovering the quiet presence that exists underneath the noise itself. Because if you can notice the mind producing fear, doubt, and mental chaos, then another question naturally begins to emerge from the silence beneath it all. Who is the one noticing the thoughts in the first place? There is a profound principle within the structure of reality that changes the rules of this game. If you are capable of hearing your thoughts arguing, then who exactly is the you in this story? You cannot be the voice inside your head. You are the infinite space where that voice echoes. Understanding that your observing essence and your mechanical mind are two separate things is your first real breath of relief. Most people spend their entire lives fused with their thoughts without realizing it. Every fearful sentence that appears in the mind immediately feels personal. Every anxious prediction feels like truth. Every internal criticism feels like identity. There is no separation. The person becomes completely absorbed into the movement of the mental storm. But something extraordinary happens the moment you begin noticing the difference between the mind and the one observing the mind. Even for a few seconds, a gap appears, and inside that gap, suffering starts losing its grip. Think about it carefully. If you can observe your thoughts, then the observer cannot be the thought itself. A cloud cannot observe its own movement across the sky. The sky is what remains still while the cloud passes through it. In the same way, there is a quiet awareness inside you that remains present while thoughts continuously rise and disappear. This awareness does not need to fight the mind because it exists beyond the noise. The problem is that most people were never taught to recognize this distinction. From childhood, they learn to identify completely with mental activity. My thoughts are me. My fear is me. My anxiety defines me. So every passing mental event becomes emotionally loaded with identity and meaning. And that creates enormous suffering, because the mind changes constantly. One moment it feels hopeful. The next moment it feels afraid. One day it believes everything will work out. The next day it predicts disaster. If your identity is attached to every fluctuation of the mind, your emotional state becomes unstable by default. You become trapped on a psychological roller coaster, driven by thoughts you did not consciously choose. But the observer inside you operates differently. The observer notices without immediately reacting. It sees the thought appear, but it does not automatically become consumed by it. This awareness is subtle, quiet, and deeply stable. It has been present during every phase of your life, even when your thoughts were chaotic. You have already experienced moments of this without realizing it. Maybe while staring at the ocean, sitting quietly in nature, driving alone at night, watching rain fall against a window. For a brief moment, the mental noise softened, and something underneath it became noticeable. A feeling of spaciousness, presence, stillness without effort. That state is not something you create. It is something you notice once the constant identification with thoughts begins loosening. And this realization changes the entire emotional dynamic inside the mind. Because once you stop believing every thought is a command, the inner battle weakens. Thoughts can still appear, fear can still arise, anxiety can still move through the body, but there is now a deeper awareness, recognizing that these experiences are temporary movements happening within consciousness, not permanent definitions of who you are. This is why observing a thought feels completely different from arguing with it. When you argue with a thought, you become entangled inside its emotional gravity. You feed it attention, resistance, and energy. But when you simply observe it without immediate reaction, something surprising happens. The thought often begins losing intensity on its own, not because you defeated it, because you stopped feeding it identity. Most intrusive thoughts survive through emotional involvement. They pull you into endless analysis because they convince you that your safety, worth, or future depends on solving them immediately. But awareness interrupts that automatic fusion. It creates distance between the observer and the mental activity, and distance changes everything. Imagine sitting beside a busy road watching cars pass. Each car represents a thought. One car carries fear, another carries regret, another carries doubt. Most people run into traffic and try to stop every vehicle with their bare hands, but the observer simply watches the movement without becoming trapped inside it. The cars continue moving. This does not mean becoming emotionally numb or disconnected from life. It means learning that awareness itself is larger than the temporary noise produced by the mind. Thoughts are events passing through consciousness, not permanent truths carved into reality. And the moment this becomes more than just an intellectual idea, the moment you actually experience it directly, a strange sense of relief begins entering the body. For the first time, you realize you may not need to control the mind as aggressively as you once believed. You may only need to stop climbing into every argument your thoughts invite you to join. The definitive cure for exhaustion is not to stop thinking, but to stop getting involved. This is where the technique of the silent witness comes in. The next time an anxious thought appears, you do not respond, justify yourself, or try to calm down. You simply notice it. You acknowledge that it is there, but you actively choose not to sit down at the debate table with it. At first, this feels unnatural. Most people have spent years automatically reacting to every uncomfortable mental movement. A fearful thought appears, and the body instantly tightens. The mind rushes to solve it, defend against it, or escape from it. The reaction happens so fast that it feels automatic, almost mechanical. But the practice of becoming the silent witness interrupts that pattern in a very quiet way, not through force, through non-participation. Imagine someone knocking aggressively on your front door in the middle of the night. Normally, your instinct would be to run toward the noise and immediately engage with it. But now, imagine simply looking through the window first. You notice the knocking without opening the door. You become aware of the presence without inviting it inside your home. This is the shift. Thoughts can arrive without receiving your full emotional involvement. And this changes the entire experience of anxiety, fear, and mental noise. Because most suffering is not created by the first thought itself. It is created by the avalanche of reactions that follows. One anxious thought appears, Then 10 more arrive because the mind senses panic and urgency. Soon the person is trapped inside an endless spiral of overthinking. The silent witness quietly breaks that momentum. The next time your mind says something frightening, instead of immediately arguing, correcting, or replacing the thought, simply notice what happens inside your body. Notice the pressure in your chest. Notice the impulse to mentally fight back. Notice how quickly the mind demands certainty. Then do something radically different. Nothing, not in a passive or hopeless way, in a conscious way. Allow the thought to exist without trying to erase it. This does not mean believing the thought. It does not mean surrendering your life to negativity. It simply means you stop feeding the cycle with resistance. You stop treating every mental event like an emergency requiring immediate action. And this is where many people experience their first real glimpse of inner freedom, because they suddenly realize something shocking. A thought can exist without controlling them. That realization is powerful. For years, many people unconsciously believed they had to obey or solve every thought their mind produced. If the mind predicted disaster, they searched for reassurance. If the mind created doubt, they analyzed it endlessly. If the mind generated fear, they tried to suppress it with positivity. But the silent witness operates from an entirely different understanding. It recognizes that thoughts are temporary mental weather patterns. Some are intense, some are irrational, some are emotionally loud. But like weather, they move when they are not resisted. The problem is that most people keep mentally chasing storms, and chasing storms creates exhaustion. When you become the observer instead of the fighter, the nervous system slowly begins relearning safety. The body starts understanding that not every intrusive thought represents real danger. This is important because the nervous system responds far more to your relationship with thoughts than to the thoughts themselves. If every fearful thought triggers panic, the body remains trapped in survival mode. But if awareness stays calm while the thought passes through, the system gradually stops reacting with the same intensity. This is why presence heals more deeply than control. Control keeps the mind in conflict. Presence dissolves the conflict by removing resistance. And at first, the ego hates this approach because it feels unproductive. The mind wants action. It wants certainty. It wants answers immediately. Sitting quietly with uncertainty can feel uncomfortable because the brain has been conditioned to believe that non-stop mental activity equals protection. But over time, something beautiful begins happening. The thoughts that once dominated your emotional world start losing momentum. Not because you defeated them through force, but because you stopped energizing them with fear and obsession. Without resistance, many mental patterns naturally weaken. You begin noticing that thoughts rise, peak, and fade on their own, just like waves. Some waves are small, some are intense, some crash loudly against the shore. But no wave remains frozen forever. The ocean keeps moving. And when you stop throwing yourself against every wave mentally, the exhaustion inside the body begins softening little by little. This is the strange paradox people rarely understand. The more you allow thoughts to move naturally without interference, the less power they seem to have over you. The emotional charge slowly drains away because the mind is no longer receiving continuous friction and resistance. And once that friction disappears, something even more surprising starts happening inside your inner world. The heavy gravitational pull that certain thoughts once carried begins collapsing completely. By refusing to engage, the thought loses its electrical charge and its gravity. If you try to punch an ocean wave, you will only create more chaos and exhaustion. But if you simply observe it, the wave passes and breaks on the shore by itself. The thought arises, crosses through your awareness and simply dissolves into the void, finally allowing your mind to receive permission to fully rest. This is the moment where many people begin noticing something they had forgotten was possible: mental space. Not perfect silence, not a life without thoughts, but space between them, space where breathing feels easier, space where the nervous system stops acting like it is under attack every minute of the day, space where the mind no longer controls your entire emotional reality. And the reason this happens is surprisingly simple. Thoughts need emotional attachment to maintain their weight. A thought by itself is often just a brief mental event. It appears, carries a certain emotional tone, and then naturally moves on. But when fear, resistance, or obsession attach themselves to it, the thought becomes heavy. It gains psychological gravity. It starts pulling more attention toward itself. Soon your entire awareness revolves around it, like planets trapped around a massive object in space. This is why some people spend weeks, months, or even years emotionally orbiting the same thoughts. Not because the thoughts are inherently powerful, but because constant engagement keeps strengthening their pull. The mind works a lot like fire. A small spark without fuel disappears quickly. But when you continuously feed it attention, emotional reaction, analysis, and fear, it keeps burning. And many people unknowingly spend their lives carrying fires they accidentally keep alive themselves. The silent witness changes this completely. The moment you stop feeding a thought with resistance, something unexpected happens. The nervous system starts recognizing that the thought is not actually dangerous. The emotional urgency weakens. The body softens. The thought still appears sometimes, but it no longer feels like an emergency that demands immediate action. This is how mental gravity collapses. Not through violence, through disengagement. At first, the ego struggles with this because it believes control equals safety. It believes that if you stop monitoring every thought, something terrible will happen. So the mind keeps trying to pull you back into old patterns. It whispers, "You should analyze this one more time. You need certainty before you can relax." This thought is too important to ignore. But over time, you begin seeing the pattern clearly. The urgency itself was often the illusion. You realize that many thoughts lose strength when they are not constantly entertained. The emotional storms that once lasted hours begin passing in minutes. Situations that once consumed your entire day no longer dominate your nervous system. You stop drowning inside your own mental weather. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this transformation is that your energy begins returning to you. For so long, your attention was trapped inside invisible inner battles, fighting fears, replaying conversations, predicting disasters, defending yourself against imagined futures. But now that energy slowly becomes available again for real life, you notice small things more deeply. The warmth of sunlight through a window, the sound of someone laughing nearby, the feeling of drinking coffee slowly in silence. Moments that once disappeared beneath mental noise become visible again because awareness is no longer completely consumed by thoughts. This is not emotional numbness, it is reconnection. The mind also begins recovering its natural rhythm when it is no longer forced into constant conflict. Thoughts come and go more fluidly. Emotions stop feeling so permanent. Sleep becomes deeper because the brain no longer believes it must remain hyper-alert all night long searching for threats. You stop treating every uncomfortable thought like a prophecy, and this changes your relationship with yourself in a profound way. Because eventually you understand that peace was never about controlling the mind perfectly. It was about removing yourself from the endless cycle of resistance that kept amplifying mental suffering. The exhaustion did not come from the existence of thoughts alone. It came from the non-stop struggle against them. Once that struggle weakens, something inside you naturally settles. Not all at once, not in a dramatic spiritual explosion, more like a lake becoming still after strong winds finally calm down. And there will still be difficult days. Thoughts will still appear. Fear will still visit sometimes because that is part of being human. But now there is distance, awareness, space. You no longer collapse into every mental storm as if it defines your identity or your future. You become less interested in winning arguments with your mind and more interested in remaining present while the noise passes through. And that quiet shift changes the entire atmosphere of your inner world. The battlefield inside your head slowly disappears, not because the mind became perfectly silent, but because you finally stopped fighting shadows that were never meant to be fought in the first place. The greatest proof of spiritual intelligence is not forcing the mind into absolute silence. That is an illusion that only creates more frustration. True liberation is creating an inner state where the mind is no longer a battlefield. The noise will still exist on some days, but you no longer need to argue with it. Just become the peaceful space that observes everything and watch your energy and your life return to your own hands. Your thoughts are not enemies sent to destroy you. Most of them are temporary waves passing through the mind, The suffering begins when you fight every wave as if your survival depends on winning. But the moment you stop feeding the conflict, something inside you finally exhales. The pressure softens, the exhaustion fades, and little by little, you remember what inner peace actually feels like. If you made it all the way here, write this in the comments. I no longer fight my thoughts. I want to know who truly stayed until the end and connected with this message. And if this spoke to something deep inside you, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen right now. There is much more waiting for you there. If you also want to support the channel and help this work continue growing, become a member. Exclusive content is coming very soon.